All right, folks, it is 2:15 and I want to get us started on time. I'm sure folks will be joining us as the speakers get started. I am the chair and discussant for this section, for this panel today. I don't know any of the faces on the screen, so hello, welcome to CREA. I'm Sylvia Epps. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Decision Information Resources, which is a research and evaluation firm in Houston, Texas. I am also a CREA affiliate researcher as of this year. And this is my first CREA conference. So a lot of firsts for me today, but I'm happy to be in this space with you all. I believe we have 3 presenters. I need to confirm that I see Tiffeny. I'm from Texas, so I may butcher your name, so apologies in advance. Is it Ramy? Okay. You guys are listed first in the program, and are you prepared to go first?
Yeah. Is there somebody else? We thought this was just for our session. We didn't know it was somebody else.
I think it's my presentation, Thiago dos Santos Molina.
I can't share the screen for the presentation. Can you?
Okay, so Hannah, can you make Ramy? Do you need to have that access?
Please, yes, I can share the presentation.
Okay, yes.
I'll be right on top of that.
Thank you. So I do have 2 other papers listed. Sara. Yes. Hi, Sara. And we'll move to you second as it's listed in the program. And Thiago. Sorry, did I say it correctly?
Yes, Thiago.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay. So we have 90 minutes for this discussion. I want to make sure we have time for discussion at the end, but also questions or clarification questions for each presenter. I believe you guys have prepared 15 minutes for your paper. Is that correct? For your presentation? Okay, yes. So I will be a pretty strict timekeeper. So know that in advance, and because I want to make sure we have time for questions. If you have clarification questions, please do raise your hand and I will go to you. If you have reactions or comments, please put those in the chat. That may inform the latter part of our discussion, and that will help us keep with time.
Will you give us a 5-minute warning? I'm not sure how you're gonna let us know.
I will do that. How about that?
Okay.
And I'll just make sure that you guys acknowledge me before I put my fingers down.
Okay.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. I believe the recording is happening. Okay, just want to make sure we have all those things set. All right, so again, welcome to the first concurrent session of the 6th CREA conference, International CREA Conference. This session that you are attending, just to make sure you're on the right plane, is decolonializing, I cannot say that, systems toward empowering and collaborative interventions. Again, I'm Sylvia Epps. I will be the chair / discussant, but that just means I'm going to help facilitate the discussion. I hope to have lively conversation between the group. And we're going to start with Tiffeny and Ramy. The title of their paper is Uncovering Ideologies of Assessing Collaborative Systems Using Critical Community Psychology.
So I've been told that the presenter view, you can all see the presenter view, right?
We can see your notes.
We can see your notes.
Yeah, we tried to figure that out. I'm sorry about that.
I think you have to move the Zoom screen over. Like this happens when you're in Zoom, so you have to make sure
better. Okay.
Same thing.
Nope, we see your notes.
Okay. Give me 1 second, please. Okay.
No problem.
So while he's getting that together, hello everyone, my name is Tiffeny Jimenez. I'm located in Chicago. I work at National Louis University as Associate Professor of Community Psychology, a doctoral program at the university. And Ramy is my co-presenter.
Hey, my name is Ramy. I'm currently at University completing my PhD in community psychology and with a focus on decoloniality in the Swana region, Southwest Asia, and North Africa, as well as in North America. Thank you. Okay.
So I still see your notes, Ramy, but I'll go ahead with the second slide. So just to give a brief overview, I know we're running out of time here quickly, just to give an overview, introduction to critical community psychology. We'll give you what that framework is, describe a case of something called the Power Reconsortium, give a little overview of the system assessment methods that we use in assessing this collaborative, and then explore from a critical analysis frame our main findings, which suggests a bit of a way of critically analyzing collaboratives in general. Okay. Yeah, that's good, Ramy. Good. So first, what is critical community psychology? So critical community psychology is very much a critical lens on a more traditional field of a psychology discipline. It's politically radical responses to bring about a better society. So there's special attention paid to power dynamics specifically, but the purpose is to draw attention to socially destructive and ecologically destructive broader patterns and structures, looking at things like capitalism, neoliberal globalization, patriarchy, colonialism, hegemony, and racism specifically. So we're actually using critique to try to unsettle or make less secure the perspectives, social structures, and practices that are considered adequate or perceived as natural or common sense.
From there, like we're talking more from like moving from critical community psychology, we decided to focus a little bit on the colonial theory and taking more of aspects of moving beyond just decolonization, but how like colonization and coloniality impact the mind and the spirit and the feeling of different communities. So it uncovered the roots causes of the dominant ideologies that we have today, whether it was like capitalism, whether it was racism and different aspects of patriarchy. And it talks more about, like, for example, examining the inherent harm done through those systems and those designs that have been happening for the past 500 years. So the point of this is to unpack all that information within the context of nonprofits in this situation here and evaluation, and how all these systems continuously shape us and impact a lot of communities, marginalized communities and racialized communities across the globe. And some of those ideas, for example, the nation state is a colonial construct, as well as different type of political aspects that we use today. In addition to, as I mentioned earlier, things related to morality, power, race, gender, as well as institutions such as nonprofits.
So briefly, I want to give you a little bit of information around something we know as the colonial matrix of power. And decoloniality is a framework that is sort of helpful in thinking about how do we expose the analytic? How do we understand the underlying ideologies that shape the structure and function of the systems that we live and work in? So if you think about this as the way that coloniality and colonial systems are experienced by others, this is a bit of a hierarchy that's embedded in a lot of our work. So the way to read this would be looking at the left, moving to the right, where the assumptions lead to some level and the artifacts are what we experience in the world. For example, man is central in all domains. We have the man over woman, which leads to systems of patriarchy and in many cases, sexism. Outcomes of this might be sexual violence or domestic violence against women, for example. And in the hierarchy of humanity, if we believe that there's a hierarchy of humanity in such the middle space here, we would see white versus others that's embedded in this colonial matrix of power, which leads to a system of racism. The separation line there indicates that humans are separate from nature in this ideological frame, where there's a whole classification of all living beings termed nature, which leads to an artifact in our societies of exploitation. Because there's a separate ontological reality for nature, we believe it's something that can be used and exploited.
So from there, we have like neoliberalism, which is a branch of coloniality, and it is part of the idea of modernization and those systems to modernize all these societies. And usually that ideology was formed in the early 20th century by Europeans and economists and philosophers after World War I, especially with the rise of, let's say, collectivism, socialism, and state-centered planning. So the whole point of that is to reform capitalism. And it became really popular in 1970s with President Nixon, which began using like policies and the framework of the neoliberal framework to implement policies in the US and internationally. And that's where you see a lot of countries going more in depth into capitalism, more going in depth into moving beyond welfare systems, into deregulating capital markets, lowering trade barriers, eliminating price controls, and the privatization of public services, such as nonprofit is one of those ways of doing things.
So, I mean, ultimately, we're living within a culture of neoliberalism, a structural force and an ideology of governance that shapes our subjectivities and identifies sites and agents of neoliberal practices. So, moving forward, this case study of the Power of We Consortium, I will outline a particular case of a transformational change initiative and demonstrate how the ideology of neoliberalism manifests within the system structures. So, the first slide with Michigan indicates or shows or demonstrates a visual just saying that United States is a settler colonial geographic land base split by state. And the system change collaborative understudy in this case is Michigan. Now, Michigan is based on these county lines. That's what these lines represent in this image. So from a broader sociological perspective taken by the state, Michigan holds more of a functionalist perspective, which believes that there are enough resources to go around. We just need to work better together to make sure that everybody gets what they need. So that assumption has set up sort of this collaboratives by county, where every county is required to have a collaborative, where the decision-making about where state and federal funds go is based within the hands of those that collaborate in making those decisions in those local spaces. Then when you zoom in a little closer, the case study we're looking at is a capital area of Michigan in the Lansing area, the Clinton, Eaton, and Ingham County sector of the state. So the next slide is the Eye-to-Eye Community Change Initiative. This was a system change initiative. They called it Infancy to Innovation, with a transformational goal of all children, youth, and young adults in the capital area will grow up with the skills and ability to be effective, participate in the knowledge economy. So very broad, long-term change goals. And this is an older rendition, but this is just to show sort of how they're structured and why they're structured. So next, theoretically, the idea behind a collaborative or coalitions in some cases are that individual organizations, if we move from left to the right, work together or come together within a system change collaborative like the Eye-to-Eye initiative to participate in some early small wins, early outcomes through collaborative participation in an organized collective entity, which leads to ideally long-term outcomes of network change that leads to changes in population needs, the needs of populations in the region. So the next slide, I'll spend very little time on this, but this is their overarching framework. So what this is really saying is that we're going to take within our purview every possible setting and organization in our community, thinking about it in terms of the relationship that people have in separate contexts along the developmental lifespan. So that goes from prenatal up to older adulthood at the top right of that. And so the very lines that cut through the middle area are indicating different workspaces or places in which younger to older folks are participating in society. So various organizations are embedded within those different settings, and they've figured out how to sort of collaborate different organizations depending on where they are in the developmental lifespan. So more specifically, the Eye-to-Eye initiative functions through a consortium called the Power of We Consortium. And their vision is a healthy community through collaboration. Their mission is identifying and implementing change strategies of issue-based groups that target underlying conditions or root causes that create problems across multiple social areas. Next. But this is the way that they are structured. So at the very bottom, you'll see that Ingham County Health Department and Capital Area United Way function as a home or backbone organization to support 12 coalitions that work together as the Power of We Consortium. And within this entity, the goal is to improve their own capacity, which will ideally strengthen social services, which will then lead to enhanced community well-being as indicated by 33 outcome indicators. And the Power Reconsortium has 6 larger, broader indicators of community well-being, such as the ones listed here, which I won't go into now, but that gives you a sense. So this study was done in collaboration with the Power Reconsortium, and they were interested in understanding these particular questions. What are the interorganizational participation networks among the participants? How does participation differ across the collaborative? What factors sort of relate to their participation? What factors constrain their participation? How does participation differ across their types? So next, I just want to give you a little bit about kind of the data that we collected, but also to connect it to the broader field of community psychology, in the sense that there's a prominent line of research and theory that's developed through the field of community psychology in general that addresses why systems change. But a lot of that emphasis has been on the assessment and evaluation of community coalitions and collaboratives. And the emphasis of this work is focused on the assumption that if our communities and organizations just worked more together, they would be able to understand the need for system change, the ways to get there, and be able to better make the changes together. And the research and evaluation in this has specifically examined challenges to collaboration, developing shared community level system change outcomes that align with community needs, and developing short-term indicators of collaboration that signify leaning into transformational longer-term change. So this has led to the use of mixed methods in social network analysis to understand the ways systems function. So in particular, we used a formative system analysis, which looks at the system parts separately, identifies relationships between parts and processes in function, discover the culture and character of a network, and recommendations to the community partner. So the nodes indicate the organizations in the network, and the lines indicate the relationships they have together. And this is what we call a sociogram. Phase 2 is a qualitative inquiry where we interviewed several different organizational members, looking at the in-depth lived experiences of their time within the collaborative. And these were semi-structured, open-ended interviews, understanding the culture of their work and what gets in the way or facilitates their partnership.
So what we're doing now, although like Tiffany did this study a little bit a few years ago, what we're trying to do is to reflect on that in relation to the decolonial framework and how it impacts, or the things that we took into consideration or didn't take into consideration. And we find it important to do so because while we're doing those kind of qualitative and quantitative studies, in the same time, there's some certain things that we didn't take into consideration, which is the whole system and how the system impact every aspect of that, let's say, collaboration, which relates to neoliberalism, pardon me, and coloniality, how they are intertwined in every aspect of society, whether it was related to justice, defense, or related to education and research and the things that related on a global level. So without thinking about these bigger macro systems, how they impact the smaller communities and the relationship between those communities and the resources that they get, there's a lack of lack of analysis, critical one, that is needed to better understand, like if those, let's say, nonprofits and collaboration work or don't work. And that's what we're hoping to do in that analysis for a bit quickly, which relates to, again, to modernity and coloniality, neoliberalism, and the nonprofit industrial complex. And as I mentioned earlier, neoliberalism is as modernization as one of coloniality's conceptualizations of the world, which is related to, in relation to this study, trends in data shows that the more privatization and the more attack on public welfare system have been, it has undermined, like this neoliberal agenda have undermined the public welfare service, and it has increased in poverty and income disparity, income and health and inequalities in the systems. And that we based that on Coburn. He did like a study based on that stuff. And he showed us that in addition to what we're gonna see here now along the way, it also shows on multiple levels, not just in the US, but internationally as well. And he did it across multiple countries. The neoliberal system in that's what the framework that we use is the nonprofits as part of the neoliberal system, as part of to have a role in as a buffer zone to maintain the status quo. And you see, like, despite the fact that we think that if more collaboration happens, then we have better results or better outcomes, as we're gonna go through this analysis, we're gonna see that that's not always the case. And there's a lot of things that you need to take into consideration while we're evaluating or designing our programs. the role of nonprofits. The buffer zone here, when we say the buffer zone, it relates to the aspects of nonprofits coming in to take over any real systematic change, that, let's say, social movements. So it professionalizes the fields, and therefore it hires people. And that way you can control the direction where it's going concerning the changes that you want to do by setting the objectives and deciding what funding, where it's going to go and when it's going to go. So in that case, like in the network here, you see that in relation to what Tiffeny is going to mention in a sec.
Yeah, so just to come back to this, the way that the state was structured or cut up by collaboratives in counties is an example of how they've created this sort of localized buffer zone, and the role of the nonprofit being to receive and distribute funds from the state. So I'd say that, you know, even just that, that in and of itself as a structural setting is sort of an exemplar of how neoliberalism is structured. But the perception is that collaboration will put the power into the hands of the people locally. What people will perceive it as something good, an act of democracy possibly, right? The services are needed, but the structure of this is not really getting the people what they really need. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle. And then in reality though, this acts as a buffer zone in reaching the root causes of systemic oppression, which maintains the status quo and controls the speed and direction of change. Now, this larger network image. This is the sociogram that we have of about 200 organizations. And I'm going to tell you about the network density of this particular network. The overall network has a 0.72 level of network density, meaning 72% of these organizations are working together. We would identify this as a well-connected network. And you would say, wow, right? Like they're doing so well. They're collaborating so well together, right? But you know, what this tells us is that public money is made available to attend to these social problems of those with less finances and money. And so, you know, part of this ideology is to show that, you know, the idea is that people will work more efficiently together and we will definitely lead to our outcomes. But that isn't necessarily the case. But what they are doing is doing that work. The reality of what's going on here is they are controlling the criteria of who gets funded, what resources are important for others, and often underfunded and too overregulated to make any change that would make their services obsolete, which would lead back to a dependence on the system overall. And just to mention this, there's a number of nonprofits, like 80% of this network is nonprofit. But just to demonstrate some of what the diversity in here, sorry, I know we're trying to move on, but okay, sorry. Can you go back for just a second, Ramy, to the network? I want to show you that the purple entities in the middle indicate the most central organizations. Those are the state and federal entities of funding sources. So purple indicates the most central in the network, and the red indicates nonprofit organizations. So you see how nonprofit organizations are sort of dominating in this network. The green indicates adhocracy, and the blue indicates market-based or sort of economic-based for-profit institutions. So it is the nonprofit industrial complex, and it is very centralized around the state and federal funding, which is the emphasis on capitalism. We did look at the differences in participation by organization culture type though, and there really were no differences. And so I wanted to mention that because we were looking at what aspects of organizational culture also influence network participation. Okay, Ramy, go ahead.
So like overall with like all the 3 points that we're going to be talking about, it relates to the way that the nonprofits are structured. They're structured to be dependent on the capitalist neoliberal system by the ruling, let's say, elite, which is not just the rich, but also the government and policymakers and those that decide what framework to use in relation to social change. So by doing so, they control the funding and where they're going to sending out, which we're going to mention like generally, but Tiffeny, we don't have any more time. How do you want to just summarize everything so people can,
Yeah, I think, so overall, I think there's a few different data points that we've got to show that's qualitative, demonstrating competition for resources, how people are sort of scattering at the bottom of the hierarchy for very little funds, and there's a higher emphasis on money in general. And so I think one of the things we had talked about was talking about how their outcomes are not necessarily getting better, and there's some challenges embedded in some of the ways that they've manifested outcomes to show that their progress. So I think in the end, we're just kind of questioning whether these system change initiatives are ever going to really get to these outcomes that they ideally believe are going to help the most disenfranchised in these systems. And we're trying to use these frameworks to really uncover what's going on. So we look forward to discussing more.
Thank you both. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news about time running out, but I have some questions myself, so hopefully we'll get to dig a little bit deeper in the discussion period. I'm going to move on to Sara. That's the second. Yes, Sara, you both should have co-host capabilities so you can share your screen. And I will give you a 10-minute, a warning at the 10-minute mark. And wait for you to acknowledge before I put my fingers down.
Okay, sounds good. Can I just test out whether or not I can share sound?
Yeah,
I think I can. Perfect. Okay, I think I can. All right. Hi, everybody. So, Sylvia, I'm sorry to ask, how much time do we have? I just want to make sure that I'm honoring everybody's time.
15 minutes. 15
minutes. Okay, so 2:55. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Sara or Sara Rezvi. I'm joining also from Chicago. Hi, Tiffeny. I'm from UIC. Ahreum, if you want to introduce yourself real quick.
Yeah, hello, everybody. My name is Ahreum, and I am a graduate student at University of Illinois in Chicago. Yeah, so I'm glad to meet everybody.
So our paper, we're going to be talking a little bit about mathematical mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, young adult texts as sites for identifying with mathematics. And just before I begin, if you're here and you're present and you're able to access the chat, just really quickly, when you think of the word mathematics, what's the first verb, noun, adjective that comes to mind? If you can put it in the Zoom chat, I would appreciate it. Wonderful. Thank you. Corey, no. Okay, great. I was told there would be no math. Well, we're going to be talking about math today. So I'm going to actually, what we're going to do is we recorded our presentation. So we're going to share our screen and share the sound so you can listen. I might be pausing intermittently to ask questions or to kind of be more interactive in the Zoom chat, just out of curiosity about what people are thinking and feeling as we're watching the presentation together. So welcome and thank you for sharing your afternoon with the both of us. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to share my sound. Hopefully that works. And please in the chat, if for whatever reason you can't see it or hear it, please do let me know and I'll do my best. Okay, here goes. By my co-author, Ahreum. We're going to be talking about our paper, mathematical mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, why texts as sites for identifying with mathematics. And in this presentation, we're going to be talking a little bit about meta-narratives and how that's interspersed in mathematics as it's rendered in young adult novels and literature in K-12 education. So here we go. We are both doctoral students at the University of Illinois at Chicago in the College of Education. We're in the mathematics curriculum and instruction program. I'll have my co-author introduce herself some more if she wants.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ahreum. I am a PhD student at University of Illinois in Chicago in the curriculum of instruction department, focusing on mathematics education.
So we're so excited to have you. We also want to shout out our contributing author, Dr. Greg Larnell, of whom we've taken many classes with, and we have a greater respect and appreciation for the work that he has helped us create today. So one of the pieces that we are highlighting in our presentation today is by Picker and Berry that was published in 2000. Take a moment to notice and wonder here what you're observing and seeing. So if you can take a moment to put in the chat, what are some observations you're making of the photo? Please go ahead and do that. And again, all of this is optional if you want.
A glitch and like I couldn't see the image that everybody else could see.
What did you do?
So I unplugged this.
Anna, you're off of mute.
Unplug it.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, username Deveso. Right, so there are some observations people are making here about this kind of student artifact. We're going to talk about that in a second. Here we go. So this is a student artifact that was collected in response to the prompt of what a typical math teacher looks like. These images were collected from places like the UK, the United States, Finland, Sweden, and I believe one more country. So one of the most surprising and startling images that students drew was observing mathematics teachers as intimidating, authoritarian, disciplinary, surveillance, and punitive. And we were wondering what has changed since 2000, since this article was published, and how that connects to young adult novels and how math teachers and math students are represented in those places as well. So one of the things that was the most interesting from this article was the fact that students had a tendency to illustrate math teachers as overwhelmingly male, regardless of country. Because of this, we kind of expected to see boys and men being represented as math doers and learners in our work around young adult literature. However, we were surprised by some of our findings, and this is going to connect to the article that we're going to bring up in a little bit by Lisa Durag, who wrote a really wonderful piece exploring how mathematics is constructed in young adult novels and what that looks, sounds, and feels like based on race, class, and gender. So this is one data set from that 2000 piece that we were just a bit like curious about and what that might mean for other representations of mathematics and math teaching and how math is constructed and viewed both by children and adults.
So we became curious whether Picker and Barry's findings are general phenomena in other forms of media. More specifically, we wanted to know how the images of mathematics were depicted in young adult text regarding race, class, and gender, and other modes of identifying. We thought this is important to think about because if we see the replicated images that only a certain group of people are believed to be able to mathematics, it needs to be disrupted for the sake of students. So we wanted to see if there is a need to break the cycle of stereotypical thoughts about mathematics. To answer this question, we used Dr. Rudin's Bishop's framework of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors because it provides a rationale for investigating the images of math in books. In her article, she argued that the books can function as windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors for young people to see themselves, to see new possibilities, and or see pathways towards fulfilling their or others' aspirations. I'm going to elaborate a little more about what it means. So she said, when books act as mirrors, it allows them to see themselves and their own experiences. Books also function as windows, this means that text can serve as ways to see out of one's own perspective and towards another's experience. In other words, we can look through to see other worlds and then compare it to our own. Finally, it's sliding glass doors. Books allow us to enter other worlds, meaning that we can move ourselves to new possibilities, turn to realities.
So what does this mean within mathematics as it's represented in young adult novels? And this is where we incorporated another paper by Lisa Durag, and the paper is called Loving and Loathing, Portrayals of School Mathematics in Young Adult Fiction. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, we can't highlight every single thing that we kind of discuss in our paper, but we're going to bring a few highlights in now from that piece. So in the article by Lisa Durag, she has a sample size of, I believe, 59 young adult novels that she reads through, codes, and analyzes about how mathematics has been represented in these young adult novels. And this is a kind of representative example of that set. So this is a book by Susan Beth Pfeffer, Life as We Knew It, a young adult novel. And one of the characters is saying the following: I got my grades and they're all pretty much as I expected. My math grade was dragged down by those stupid tests, or by those tests where I was stupid. And we found this really intriguing because it's describing how mathematics is seen by these characters in these books. And one of the tables that Durag analyzes is from a lens of gender. And now she puts it in the gender binary here. But as you can see in the note at the bottom, of the books that she sampled, only one student out of the entire 59 books that she was looking through identified a non-binary student. So we were a bit surprised because we were expecting similar representations as we saw in Picker and Barry's, but we were surprised by this because the data findings are a bit different. we saw that in her work, in Durag's work, there was equal representation of both boys and girls as good and bad at mathematics, unlike our initial expectation. So we may be able to say, wow, this is good progress. But Durag goes into this a little bit deeper, and this is something that we wanted to highlight here in our presentation. So when we zoom out on the lens of girls, which girls are we talking about? All girls? Some girls? Which girls? And the finding was simply this: not all girls were positioned as able in mathematics when we think about an intersectional framework, particularly when we look at race, class, and gender. So girls are good at math, belonging to a homogeneous group: white, middle, upper class, heterosexual, thin, able-bodied, cisgender, and beautiful conventionally. So we think that even though the gaps between gender are narrowed down, we still need to do some more work regarding race, class, and gender, and how these characters are positioned as doers of mathematics in young adult novels.
So understandably, there are sample sizes of 59 young adult books. That are still small numbers to make any conclusions assertively. However, we think it is not ignorable numbers too if the similar stories appear again and again, which Adichie called the single story. So in our TED Talk, Adichie argued that the single story is dangerous because it shows a people as one thing, as only one thing over and over again, and that is what they become. So far, we discussed what kind of a single mathematics story is told in young adult fiction. We talked about how mathematics is seen negatively and who are seen as capable mathematics doers. There are many more things that we can talk about, such as the images of math teachers and math class. But the point is, the single math story signifies certain messages that locate the learning, creating, and doing mathematics within particular sites of power and domination.
So with respect to some of our conclusions and suggestions, one of the things that we're thinking about is how we can disrupt this idea a bit more, that there's only one type of story that is constantly reproduced over and over again, whether it's students viewing math teachers as intimidating, as surveillance, as disciplinarians, or as students themselves feeling that they can't or are incapable of doing mathematics based on their race, class, gender, and other social locations within their cultures. So Stewart has a really wonderful article that came out in 2017 about the language of appeasement. And she's interrogating whether diversity and inclusion are enough, or how do we actually think about issues of equity and justice and what that looks and sounds like in these spaces. So we're choosing to highlight one question in particular, again, due to the sake of time. So diversity, in our view, as we adopted Stewart's language here for this particular piece, is asking who's in the mathematics classroom, right? Do we have a fair representation of people? Because yes, representation does matter. But what we're actually asking is, how can we move beyond just representation? That is important, but it's not sufficient, we're arguing. So we're asking, equity is responding here. Who is trying to create, construct mathematics, but can't? Whose presence as a math doer, learner, creator is under constant threat or erasure? And that's incumbent upon us as educators, whether we're teaching literacy or whether we're teaching mathematics, about how we use that question to understand how we invite students into the act of actually doing mathematics. Because some students have been rendered and erased in those spaces a priori. So how do we make sure that that's being disrupted in our classroom spaces? Next slide. We owe a lot of this work to Literacy Twitter and Literacy Twitter educators. They're noted over here on the slide. If you'd like to check out more of what the work is that they do, check out the hashtags and check out the 31 Days IBPOC hashtag, where educators, primarily people of color, are invited to talk and discuss and write about their experiences as teachers of color in these spaces. Our paper, if you'd like to learn more, it can be found in the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy. It was published in 2020. And we just want to highlight the fact that is noticing and wondering the fact that mathematics is very much positioned in a particular location in young adult novels. Is that enough? Or can we represent and find different ways of interrogating that within our own classroom? So these are a couple of books that try to offer a different window, a different mirror, a different sliding glass door to understand that mathematics is a global and human cultural product, regardless of class, race, and gender, that we are all participating in this work together. And this is one of our last paragraphs in our paper, and I'm just highlighting a few sentences here. As Ara mentioned, there's power and other dynamics at play when we talk about mathematics. Mathematics is not a neutral space. So we cannot discuss issues of why math identity matters without attending to how power diffusively operates within that very identity creation. So we believe, as the authors of this paper and as educators, that all students are capable of owning, doing, and seeing themselves as mathematicians, and that it is our shared responsibility of humanities and STEM educators alike to ensure that our students are empowered to become their fully authentic and realized selves in mathematics spaces and beyond. So thank you for listening. These are our references from our paper, just a couple, and we really appreciate your time. If you have any questions or feedback, please feel free to contact either of us. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Okay, that's our presentation. When we actually start talking, hopefully I'm very curious about where you see yourselves in books and what books were mirrors and windows and sliding glass doors for yourselves and how that might relate to maybe your own math journey. We are math people. So thank you for that. That's it.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Ahreum. We do have some time for questions. So if you want to, we have 5 minutes to either field questions, clarification questions, or if you have questions for the group.
Sylvia, I will present after the questions.
Yes. Any questions or comments for the last presenters? I will say that I have a 4th grader boy who has dyslexia, and I taught him, homeschooled him all of last year and the last half of 2nd grade. So I was the one that was like, I was seeing my son's struggles in being back in the classroom and not having as many resources. So I think definitely a very important topic. Okay, I will take this. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you. I mean, it's not lost on me that, you know, like the reality of how much reproductive labor has been exploited and, you know, and used in such a manner during the pandemic. And of course, obviously before, but it's been exacerbated by everything right now, and how much of that has been incumbent upon families and parents and teachers alike to pick up systemic issues that are beyond just individual solutions. So yeah, I get it.
Yeah, I mean, I consider myself a pretty educated mom, but I struggled. So I think I hear you, most definitely. Okay, folks, we will move on to the next paper. Please feel free to continue putting questions in the chat, and I promise that we will have a more open discussion at the end. I will move on to Thiago, and I will give you a minute, a warning at the 10-minute mark. So,
okay.
There you go.
Let's set here, set up. We just say. Oh. So first of all, my co-author is my advisor, Professor Roseli Fishman. She is not here. So I'm representing our pair. I'm from Brazil. I'm speaking from Brazil. My university is the University of São Paulo, the School of Education. I'm a PhD candidate, and my research is about relationships between the school culture and the hegemonic idea of school culture and Africa diaspora epistemology and African diaspora practices in formal education. So I will read. I will ask you to read. I think it will be better to express what I'm thinking. Just to check that. Okay. Island of Hope: Challenging School Culture Through African Brazilian History Culture is the professorial title of my PhD research in the School of Education at the University of São Paulo in Brazil. In this research, I want to look at African Brazilian pedagogies and I want to look at African Brazilian pedagogies through the lens of African diasporic epistemology. Thus, I also intend to articulate a transnational dialogue among African Americans schooling experience, and Americans here have a continental meaning and not only the US Black population, between pedagogies developed by African Brazilians and African diaspora educators. Both dominant school culture and historical dehumanization of the non-white population are a transnational shared heritage. Aníbal Quijano, just over here. Sorry, my mistake. Aníbal Quijano named this power structure as rearrangement of as coloniality, a cultural form of domination inherited after the end of the political colonialism. Here, I reword my own question using Quijano's concept. If African descendants epistemology could support a new way of envisioning the schooling process, can we redesign the school culture? Schools and school cultures have arrived in your time, interrogated and attacked. According to Prudence Carter, in quote, education is also a system of cultural meanings that educators, students, and communities attach to everyday schooling practice. Who is defined as a successful or smart student is often predicated on a specific cultural practice of a particular social group, close quotes. Black scholars and social activists have already a centenary tradition in denouncing it, and maybe the most powerful critique of dominant school culture still is Carter Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro. In his words, open the quotes. The thought of the inferiority of the Negro is drilled into him in almost every class he enters and in almost every book he studies. And the quotes. According to Jarvis Givens, the father of Black History Month criticized the misuses of the scientific knowledge and helps to understand the ideology of white supremacy as a technology across diasporic sites. Thus, can we ignore the coloniality spread by dominant school cultures? Historians of education have used this term as an analytical category, and the Spanish professor Antonio Vinhal offers a broad definition of school culture. School culture, in his words, thus understood, gathers a set of theories, ideas, principles, norms, guidelines, rituals, inertias, habits, and practice. It also includes ways of doing and thinking, mentalities, and behaviors. All these features have been settled over time in the form of traditions, regularities, and unquestioned game rules, which are shared by their actors within educational institutions, close the quotes. So, considering the ideas above, what are these unquestioned game rules? Are there forces compelled to change their initial state of school cultures? Who is applying these forces and how are they doing it? Once inertia embodies consolidated traditions in school cultures, are these forces enough to overcome the resistance to change when change implies revolving the school soils? So, I put this question, and now I will explain a little bit of my study case, of my cases mainly, saying in this topic, Island of Hope, challenge dominant school cultures. So, from 2008 to 2011, I analyzed the two projetos políticos pedagógicos you call in Brazil, or we call it PPP, Political Pedagogical Project. And they are related to a public school inside an African Brazilian traditional community. Currently, I added a third case. It is also an elementary public school, which I worked as teacher and instructional coordinator from 2012 to 2018. The two schools are in Salvador, capital of Bahia, the major state in Brazil Northeast region. All of my research cases also have a common goal. They intend to challenge the foundations of Western-centered school culture. However, there are no coincidences. They are nearby each other. Salvador is widely recognized for having the highest concentration of Black inhabitants outside the African continent. One of its epithets, Black Rome, illustrates the imaginary about this place as a global reference and center for the preservation, production, and dissemination of Black culture in the African diaspora. Projeto político pedagógico is a center concept in this construction, and it's a very common expression in Brazilian pedagogical research, in Brazilian educational research. And this acronym, or the PPP, means, in a little translation, Political Pedagogical Project or Program in the US, in English. And this idea synthesizes the collective aims and grounds pedagogical practice in the teaching learning process. PPP became mandatory in most municipal and state school systems around Brazil after military dictatorship, and it can be understood as a letter of intention issued by schools to express the community choices in education. And it has implicitly or explicitly a political worldview. Thus, this document accounts on why a particular school desire for their students. And the last P stands for project, to express that a PPP is a working in progress and must be reviewed from time to time. And the community I just mentioned is the Ileaxé Opofonjá, one of the most prestigious African Brazilian traditional community, also called terreiro. We call it terreiro de candomblé. This terreiro occupies a large area in São Gonçalo do Retiro, an inner city neighborhood in Salvador City, and its name means, in free translation, the powerhouse sustained by Afonjá. Afonjá is an avatar of Xangô, the Yoruba god of thunder, but also is a legendary king in the former Kingdom of Oyo in Nigeria. The Eugeniano dos Santos Elementary School is a building inside this territory. The first PPP I analyzed is called Projeto Ireaió, a pedagogical program proposed and supervised by Dr. Wanda Machado, an educator and community member. Since 1999, it has been implemented out at Eugeniano dos Santos Elementary School, and Machado's proposal aims to contextualize the teaching learning process with African oral narratives transcribed in writing text form. However, during the research, followed a tip from my advisor and co-author of this paper, Professor Roseli Fishman, I found out the projeto Mini Comunidade Obabi. In this project, Mini Comunidade Obabi become the second case. Obabi happened in the same building of Eugeniano dos Santos. Just take a look at the picture. This is the school. This building was constructed in the 70s to house the Projeto Obabi. But it was almost a project forgot by the time. Obabi took place in the same building occupied currently by the Eugeniano dos Santos and occurred from 1976 to 1985. It aimed to complement formal schooling for communist children who dropped out of school after suffering racism and religious intolerance, and was led by Mestre G, one of the most famous African-Brazilian artists, and Marco Aurélio Luz, a former professor in Universidade Federal da Bahia. Despite a temporal distance of 2 decades, both projects share similar pedagogical thoughts and schooling practice in 3 key ways. Firstly, Mini Comunidade Obabi and Eugeniana explicitly intended to build a pedagogy based on Yoruba oral tradition, re-elaborated along to African-Brazilian history. So, their pedagogies are rooted in African diasporic epistemology. Secondly, both projects contextualize a mandatory content in the school curriculum through mythological narratives, aiming to close the gap between the schooling process and the community's culture. Just a note, myth in this work means fabulous or heroic narratives, which Africans used to teach ethical and moral values for their children. In this case, Yoruba people, Yoruba myths. Thirdly, the outcomes of the schooling process at both schools inspire artistic presentations and exhibitions scheduled by the end of each academic term. It is an invitation to the community to perform aesthetic creations based on its own culture. The third case is the Parque São Cristóvão Elementary School, and its PPP is called Projeto Baobá. This school was opened in 2006, and Parque São Cristóvão shares with Mini Comunidade Eugeniana the theoretical references from Yoruba oral myths in writing texts. But this school does not have any relationship to traditional communities. Notwithstanding, African diaspora epistemology repertoire in Projeto Baobá looks like to be wider than their elders' comrades. The PPP in the teacher's plan at Parque São Cristóvão Elementary School includes songs, movies, workshops, and all types of resources that can bring into the classroom experience of African people in Brazil, Americas, or even in the African continent. The Projeto Baobá organizes Parque São Cristóvão curriculum dividing the academic year in 4 units, and each grade adapted that specific subject to the current unity to fulfill official requirement. Just to close here, I wanted to show you that so this is the units 1, 2, 3, and 4. What each unit has a central subject. Each subject is adapted for the teachers from the 1st grade to the 5th grade, and every unit has some materials in Portuguese mainly, and it's a translation I did here to show to you. And we can see like African myths transcribed in the first line, the second line, the last column. African myths transcribed in children's book, like Uloma is our children's book, and Tayo's Black Power. And we can see in this 3rd line, the last column, Yoruba mythology to teach African people's ways of life. So in this example, the 2nd grade, this topic studies the ancient origins of Salvador, and they use Yoruba mythology to teach how Black people arrived in Salvador and where they are from, and what are the culture of Yoruba, Angola, and other African peoples in the African continent. We pass through the enslavement period and teach what is preserved, what is kept in Brazil, in current Brazilian culture. Well, my time is closed. I think it's finished. Oh, Rezvi, go ahead with me, please. I can comment if you have some question about the current steps, but the final thoughts is I just read these two. I want just to read these 2 questions to close. It has been a challenge to the municipal or it should be the county board of education to keep this school working. So in one of the challenges, the teachers hired by the public schools, by the public school board in Salvador. So must we consider that personal belonging and professional identities cannot always be modified? Or if people change over the years, should we recognize that school culture is also changing, though slowly? If I had time, I would explain, but it's the central idea here is that the teachers who is working in public school are not familiar with the African Brazilian culture. And so how can we overcome that fact if they are not able to receive in training information? And the last question, are African Brazilian projects like I showed you in pedagogical practices provoking processes of transformation in dominant school cultures? So I think there are some transformations and something that are the same as in the past. And my research is to develop these 2 questions in the current time. Thank you for having me, for listening, and for your time.
Thank you, Thiago. So we've made it through the papers. I appreciate the folks who've stayed through all papers and now ready to engage in some discussion. Thiago, you went a little bit over, so I'm going to go ahead and move us to the general discussion, but I welcome people to both use the chat and to raise their hand if they like to ask a question. I want to just start by saying just a few things. One thing about each paper, each presentation, just some reactions that came to mind and questions that maybe we can field in the discussion period or just things for people to think about. So for Tiffany and Ramy, one of the things that I thought about as you kept talking about showing the network maps and sort of some of them very dense in some areas, not as much. I thought thinking about how to use even the picture, the maps to inform stakeholders about where some of the gaps may be, or some segments of the population not really being represented or as equally represented as others. It's just in some of my own work, having a community look at how their networks are forming, changing, not changing, and how some areas of their community are just not as represented was, I think, an eye-opening experience for folks who are so narrowly focused on a segment of the population or a segment of the community. So I was intrigued to see how you guys are putting those maps together, and would like to hear a little bit about how you use that to inform the folks you are focused on. For the second paper, Sara and Ahreum, I think the thing I shared a little bit about my own personal story with my struggles with a fourth grader struggling with math. I think what goes along with that is representation. I think you guys mentioned that briefly, a lack thereof in books and classrooms and leadership in tutoring centers. I think there are lots of opportunities for the story to start to shift, the narrative to start to shift. But I think I was very compelled by the cartoons that you included, and you could see from the chat that folks that resonated with them. And I'm willing to bet that what folks put in the chat as their reaction to that it reflects sort of their own struggle or trauma when it comes to mathematics. So definitely something that it doesn't end in the early grades, and I think doing some reflection about that as individuals may also help us understand how to help teachers, facilitators, administrators. For the third paper, I don't know how much folks know about Texas. I live in Texas. The thing that rose to the top for me as an individual is that Texas does not have, is not a climate that is open to truth telling in the school setting. There have been some recent laws recently signed that stops the teaching of truth telling in schools, and people are being fired, suspended, replaced because they're insistent on keeping the curriculum or introducing students to truth telling through their curriculum. That is, as a Texan, is really disheartening, but that puts the burden, and the burden's already on parents, but it puts the burden on parents in a different way, because not only do we have to expose children to the true history, we also have to remove what they're being taught in the schools. So thinking about how communities, well, let me say this, Thiago, you talked about the, let's see, what did my notes say? How the school culture, is the school culture changing as people change? And I think that is certainly true. I think what's less true, or maybe on a slower pace, is that school leadership doesn't change at the same pace, and that the folks who are making decisions about what goes on in schools aren't changing at the same pace, and sometimes aren't even interested in understanding some of those differences, so that they can influence what's happening in the classrooms. So I will stop with my comments and open the floor for the panel or any other folks that have questions. I see there's some questions that have been put in the chat. I haven't read them because I've been talking. So I will open the floor and take a look at the questions. It's open. Unmute yourself, raise your hand, unmute yourself. Whoever wants to jump in first. Okay, go ahead, Karen.
There was also like a question by the Vesto earlier on. So maybe after Karen asked it, we can answer it for him.
Sure, sure.
It's really interesting papers and very diverse scholarly work. And I wondered, sort of bringing it back to the world of evaluation, if there were any sort of takeaways from these broader issues, which I very much appreciate, to evaluation practice in these settings, or evaluation theory for that matter, whichever way you want to take it. But I was just curious from these different epistemological and practice perspectives, what might we extract to be better evaluators?
Thank you, Karen. Before we move on to Ramy, I just wanted to share that I think when I was teaching in a graduate education program, I felt very strongly about ingraining into students who were going to go into classrooms about the importance of data crunching and using data to inform some of their decisions. Think about evaluation in the same way now, like it needs to also just be a part of the training for the people who are in these spaces and classrooms and influential positions, because without it, they are relying on news reports. They're relying on old evaluations that were not necessarily done appropriately, culturally responsibly, or even with the right populations. Tiffeny, Ramy, sorry.
Well, I just wanted to respond to Karen's question in terms of sort of the work we did, and then maybe we could get to the question that was in the chat around our stuff too. But sure. And your point too, Sylvia, I think the social network analysis as a tool for assessment has been really helpful. That was the whole idea behind doing it in the first place. The network was like, please do a social network on us, because we really want to see, see ourselves in the picture, and we want to see if our relationships are really manifested in the ways that we would hope that they would. So the data continue to be useful for this network for a few years beyond its development, and they continue to chop it up to be able to see how their networks related to their outcomes. I think the question we're kind of coming at that data with today is, we've been working for years on these coalitions and systems change initiatives, and I worked on teams of people that were trying to understand how do we make them more efficient and more effective, and really understand how short-term indicators can be indicative of long-term change. And I think they're using collaboration, or the types of collaboration you see in the network, as those indicators of we're going to get to those better outcomes one day, right? But it seems from the literature from this more critical angle, and we've looked at least these two articles by Kivel and Coburn, there is data to suggest that the more we embed ourselves in the ways of this collaboration across organizations and aligning along these missions of organizations that think, oh, if we just do our work better, it's going to get to those outcomes. If we just do our services better, more efficiently. But that's exactly what the neoliberal system wants you to do, is to work better with less money, more efficiently, more targeted. But the funding that goes from the top of the hierarchy economically into those spaces for public monies do not shift. Like, they continue to accumulate money at the top, whereas this smaller amounts of money go to the bottom. And then we're only really focused on maintaining finances as the main resource that everybody's trying to hold on to. And so it becomes less about the input from community, but also community input was obtained, just to be clear about that, to inform the work of the collaborative. They would do focus groups with various communities based on zip codes and different regions of the city area. But I just think, to your question, Karen, I think we're still grappling with how do we keep in mind the critical nature of these kinds of critical questions when thinking about to what extent is it even valuable to put all this effort into these larger system change initiatives, right?
And how do we practice within these structures that may basically overwhelm and suffocate the values that Stafford was talking about that we've come together to celebrate. But so thank you for that.
And I know Ramy may have an addition.
Yeah, like to what Tiffany is saying, and to answer also in relation to that, what Deveso was asking in relation to, it seems you are suggesting that nonprofits would actually perpetuate inequality systems. Yes, they do. It's not their intention. The people that they're working in those fields, they're not like viciously trying to harm people. No, they believe in those causes and they want to help them out. But the way that nonprofits are structured, and that's why we're linking it to neoliberalism, the way that's structured, it is dependent on funding. Who controls that funding are the people that are well off, whether they were privately, like businesses, or it was the government. And you see that replicate in both the international scene, like in international nonprofits and NGOs, as well as in local nonprofits in the US and Canada, North America, and Europe. So you see that all those systems have, in different places, have similar kind of structures. One group of people control the funding and control the objective of what's going to be funded, when it's going to be funded, and how much they're going to give it to them. At the same time, the people working in those nonprofits are extremely overwhelmed because they are underfunded and they are understaffed and overregulated. So they have to deal with all that ideas of things that they need to do with. So by the end of the day, they only have like this much in comparison to this much funding to deal with the community. So the money being given to those nonprofits are not enough to support those communities, which comes to the question, the problematic nature of nonprofits as an intervention, because they are being used as a Band-Aid effect to just put some Band-Aid on the scratch, and this scratch is too big for that Band-Aid though. So we're not dealing truly with systematic issues, and nonprofits, how they are structured, it's impossible for them to deal with these structural issues, even if they collaborated. And that's why like Tiffany's study was amazing, because their collaboration was successful. Like they did a great job at collaborating, at communicating and all that. And yet the outcomes or the impacts of how the community still is concerning economy, concerning health, concerning that is still not good at all. Concerning racism is still not good at all. And a lot of the nonprofits in the study did not even think about racism, did not even think about things related to sexism. They're just stuck within their own framework. And those folks are definitely pushing to make some change in people's life and their communities, but yet a lot of things that are important are irrelevant within their consciousness. So when we're thinking about evaluation, we're not just thinking about the evaluation of the program or the nonprofit itself, we're thinking also of the evaluation of the system that the nonprofit is within. So if we only include the program, sure, we can do that, but there's gonna be a lot of things not part of that equation, not part of that discussion, which we need to have in order to have a fuller picture of what's to be done. And in Coburn's article, they see clearly, like since the 1970s, like since like Nixon started this neoliberal kind of policy implementation within the US and internationally, they started seeing the health and inequalities, like social justice inequalities and all that going down, while like the welfare systems being replaced with nonprofits. So they did see a correlation between these two, which was clear to them. So in addition, for example, if you are a nonprofit evaluator, that's going to be difficult for you to include all that stuff because, again, you're rigid with the funding that you have and what the objective of nonprofit they want. But as a, let's say, academic or a researcher or an inquirer, then that becomes a little bit easier for us to be much more critical and to collaborate with other evaluators that work with communities and nonprofits. And for me, I don't feel that on the long run, nonprofits are the solution. I've worked with NGOs and nonprofits for like 10 years. I'm tired of that system. I don't think it is the direction we should go with, but in the same time, they are what is needed today because we don't have alternative options. What that means, we need to work together on finding alternative options to come and replace these. There's something like mutual aid, for example, which is local community-based. And so you have some aspects that we're working on to further investigate. And that's what Tiffany and I hope to do in relation to that conversation. Sorry, I spoke a lot. It's just to cover two things.
You can tell the passion is no problem. I do want to give Sara and Ahreum a chance to ask. I think you were going to ask a question about of the group about how they identified with the mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. Do you guys want to pose that question to the group?
Sure. And thank you for everybody's conversation so far. I'm kind of mostly just deeply thinking right now.
Right.
So, right, the question that we were kind of curious about, right, is what books were mirrors to you? What books were windows to you? What books were sliding glass doors to you growing up, or even now in adulthood? So I'll leave that there for a second. Where did you kind of see yourself either reflected in books or see a different perspective that kind of challenged you or made you think in a different way? And you can put it in the chat. And the reason why we're asking is because we're trying to think about how we can reclaim knowledge, and that includes mathematics. Mathematics has been used as a proxy for intelligence. It's been used to categorize and demarcate and put children into boxes rather than thinking about mathematics as a cultural product. So I'm trying to think about ways that we can do that in our work, and what are some books and books that have acted in that way in a different capacity for you that are not math related, but just, yeah, thank you. So we have Culture and Truth by Renat. Thank you for that. I'm not familiar with it. I'll have to check it out. And feel free to unmute and talk about why.
Well, why is because it's the first book that got, when I was starting to work on validity and culture, it was the first book that sort of paired those two, and it recognized the depth of importance of what I later called experiential validation. In other words, he tells stories of his life experience, and of not fully being able to understand what he was observing, let's say, in rural tribal communities, until he had a life experience that was devastating. And then that depth of passion connected to what he was seeing and gave it new meaning, basically. And so it just sort of exploded my brain, because I was talk about math. I mean, I was taught validity from a measurement perspective, but Culture and Truth was approaching validity from an experience of what is truly known. And it set me in a whole different direction than I had expected. So that's why I would pick that.
Thank you for that, Karen. And Nirupa and Sylvia, I appreciate you trying to think about where you saw yourself ethnically or not. I'm Pakistani, and that wasn't an experience for me either in terms of seeing myself reflected in books for a really long time. It's, I think, a little bit different now with South Asian writers and artists kind of being more explosive on the scene, but it's still a long ways to go, I think. Mm-hmm.
No, I agree. But I do think that there, like you said, there's more representation now, but at the same time, those that represent is not across the board, right? Like you may have a section in a teacher's classroom, or in the library, but I think just the majority is still, not focused on cultural differences and thinking about how can we determine the harm that is doing or undoing some progress, in particular for kids in their formative years. So
right.
I really like the idea of thinking about that, both from a parent and an individual perspective. So I appreciate this conversation.
Yeah, and just to close off, I mean, the reason why we're interested in this, right, is, at least for me, I don't want to speak for Ahreum, but mathematics is a political space. It's a non-neutral space. It's a colonial space. It's a Western space, but it doesn't have to be, right? And so the idea of radically envisioning or dreaming, like what Thiago was talking about with his work, right? We're thinking about that as well with respect to STEM, and we can either use mathematics to build more bombs and more prisons and more things that oppress and hurt people, or we can use it to think about a future that actually we can all conceivably survive within. And mathematics is a space that can establish that. It's not the only space. We need the poets and the artists and everybody else along with us, but it is a space. So what space are we creating when we don't see so many of ourselves reflected in that space is the fundamental question. So yeah. Thank you.
Well, and it's a space that now is being vilified and politicized, the whole trusting the science or mistrusting the science. We live in an astonishing time.
Agreed. Go ahead, Sara.
I just want to say that, Sara, what you just said, like one of the things that I think about, because like I do work in elementary math and I was a teacher, and one of the things that I think a lot about is just how frustrating it is, how it almost seems like it's sort of inevitable that girls in third grade start to say, I'm bad at math, or, all that. And so what you were just saying there, I was like, oh, so that's why it feels inevitable that so many kids get turned off of it, because it is sort of, it's sort of this like white male political thing that's used to build bombs or whatever. So of course, it actually makes a lot of sense. So thank you.
Yeah, Sara, I hear you. So one of the prominent mathematics educator, Dr. Schoenfeld, once stated that like a high quality mathematics is not sufficient for creating powerful math classrooms. So he mentioned, the Dr. Schoenfeld mentioned about like access and agency or ownership identity part also should be considered. So we just thought that maybe talking about using the young adult textbooks perhaps in the teacher education context will create an opportunity for them to reflect more about, engaging like math class to their students. Yeah.
I don't think people always realize how important representation is unless they don't see it themselves. I hear this across so many different domains. Thank you both for the conversation. I do want to move us on to Thiago so we can dig a little bit deeper into any questions or comments around his presentation.
I had put one in the chat. We're kind of doing a side chat over here, but
fair enough. No, I was typing. I agree with you, but then I got distracted. I think one of the things that question made me think about was this idea that the teachers in these classrooms in Thiago's study don't understand the history, and even if they had a responsibility to teach it via textbook, a lack of understanding, appreciation, respect would damage, I think, their delivery, maybe not across the board, but it sort of seems like this kind of one of the questions you raised, Tiffeny, in your paper about will systems change do enough to get to the real outcomes? And I thought about that same thing, and when Thiago raised that question.
Oh, I'm trying to organize the answers because I'm not so fast to write in English yet. I'm studying.
No problem. I mean, I think we can certainly. Why don't you put your email in the chat and invite people to reach out to any of the authors. Go to the WOVA app. I think details are there. But go ahead, Thiago.
I think Tiffeny asked me something about political engagement, and in the picture in the bottom, it's a picture on the march for a march for Black consciousness we did in 2017. So, but the political engagement we got with this project is in a small scale. Right? It's a community scale. It's very difficult to transpass to the dimension of the city of Salvador. That's the third biggest city in Brazil. But even in Ilha Chapaponjá, as impacts São Cristóvão, we can see some engagement to keep the project alive. So it is not possible to generalize these projects for all schools. Also, is also possible because the community like the project to keep them alive in the public school, but in these specific communities. So it's not easy to transfer to other communities to do the same job. And I need the other presentation to explain that for a while. Other question, I forgot who asked me. It was about, I want to stop share. Okay. The methods of assessment and how we did that, how the teachers know if the project is working. One way we assess this project is to look at the kids. We can see after some time the girls coming to the school in natural hair, the boys proud to say they are Black, they are proud. Just to ease my answer, that's the Jim Brown word. But they explicitly say we are proud of being Black, we are beautiful. They recognize the racial inequalities in their communities, or in the newspaper facts, in other ways. But for these projects, in special the Park São Cristóvão that I worked, we create a culture of in-service training. So we could make some studying meetings with the teachers, show part of the curriculum, the historical curricula we would like to create in all of the grades, provide the materials, make the research, got passed through the publishers asking today donate some books for us. So it was, for my part, in my principal and the vice principal in the school, was an activist work. Right? It wasn't a job for me and my partner. It was a life change job. Not for me, for them. Right? So I think this is a part of the changes I can relate it. And to close, Karen said about the relationship between epistemology and how to create better evaluators. And I think is what I can say from my experience, that we could create a little bit better evaluators when we talk to them. We need to transform the epistemological basis of the teacher practice, and not only to include a fact of history of Africa or a fact of Egypt and the math development. We need to put it together to contextualize interdisciplinarily with our teachers.
Thank you, Thiago, and thank you for a great session. Many thanks to the authors and the work that went into the presentation, as well as the research that you presented. I think we're all asking the tough questions, which, I think we have to stay at it. I think this part of the research this area of research that we do, I think can feel very thankless. And also it's just hard because we're trying to help the folks that we're focused on overcome or ourselves overcome, much more trauma that's been way even before our generation and we know cannot be undone with what we're doing in our generation, but I definitely think we can make some progress towards it. So I appreciate the conversation. I hope to see some more of your faces in the other CREA presentations or perhaps later in the next, I had it up and then what do we have?
The plenary coming up.
The keynote address, yes. So any last minute thoughts? Anybody want to say anything else before we part and have some dinner before we come back together?
I would just say that I think you did an amazing job as discussant. I would have been challenged to put those 3 papers together as you did. And I just thought you did really well at that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that feedback. All right, guys. Nice to meet you. Hope to see your faces again. Have a good evening if I don't see you later tonight. Bye.
Sylvia, may I do a question for you? Just
sure.
It's the first time I participate in a congress outside Brazil. And it's very common here. We receive a paper stating we participate in some session and blah, 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 present the job. And to apply for a reimbursement in my university, I need this paper. So
sure.
May you explain how it's working?
Yeah, so I'm going to put my email in the chat and I can certainly follow up with the CREA leadership. And I will also take down your email, but feel free to just send me a quick note so that I don't drop the ball on this. But I'm happy to explore that and get back to you.
I thank you a lot.
All right, guys. Thank you.